Thank you, everybody. I'm Andrew Watson, CEO of Happy Cabbage Analytics, and today I'm going to talk about how inventory is the center of the universe. So really quickly, introduction. Like I mentioned, I'm Andrew Watson, CEO of Happy Cabbage Analytics. What is Happy Cabbage Analytics? We are a platform that helps retailers optimize inventory and maximize sell-through at retail. And we do this through a retail optimization platform. We have specific tools that are for specific jobs to get done, including a tool for marketers, a cool tool for buyers, and a tool for bud tenders. And today I'm really going to dig in more into like why we actually built out our tool for buyers. Now, one way you can kind of understand the aspects of the jobs to be done that each tool is around at a retailer is by understanding a retailer's P&L, right? And so this is an example of a standard mature market retail P&L for a retailer who's making about $5 million a year. What you can see is at the end of the day, after 280E in taxes, they're basically breaking even at the end of the year. And what you realize very quickly when you look at a retailer like this is the inventory is the most expensive thing by far on the menu. It's nearly half of all of the revenue that they're making. On top of that, decisions around the inventory. So for example, vendor-sponsored discounts, for example, making sure that you have SKUs that customers actually like and want to purchase, ultimately affect the revenue. So it's actually even more multiplicatively impactful to a retailer to get the inventory right than just dealing with the overall cost of that inventory. And on top of that, the inventory and the cost of it all comes down to margin, and that margin is what pays for everything else. So getting the inventory right doesn't just affect the cost of the inventory and the revenue, but it ultimately affects the ability for a store to break even at the end of the day, which is why inventory is the center of the universe. So let's start asking ourselves, how well are retailers today addressing this problem and handling their inventory? So really quickly, to set some baseline understanding of how inventory works. In general, inventory is half of all revenue. Wholesale prices are set by brands and distributors. Inventory is delivered into the store via these batches, and those batches have a wholesale cost, right? Generally, the way retailers price then how they're actually selling the products is doubling and adding the tax onto it. So for example, if I'm taking in a Kiva, batch of Kiva, 20 units of Kiva Camino gummies, they're sold to me by Kiva at $10 a unit. I am pricing it at $20 a unit, and then a customer is paying $20 plus tax out the door. Generally speaking, when those units are brought in, I'm not actually paying cash up front. I am buying them on consignment, and I have net terms. So 14 days, 10 days, 30 days, in which later the Kiva rep is going to come back and I have to pay them back. Which means that any inventory I have on my shelf, so to take that example, I take 20 units in at $10 a unit, so that's $200, or sorry, $200. That means that I have that as debt that is owed until I pay that $200 back to the distributor. So in an ideal world, the way this would work is I get 100 grand of product in. I list it at 200 grand before tax. Over the next 14 days, I sell 200 grand of product, and then I pay the vendor back 100 grand in cash when the vendor comes to me at day 14. And then ultimately, I then use that 100 grand of cash to pay for another 100 grand of product that I then go off and sell. So a very basic way to look at this is at the beginning of a month, how much in dollars do I have on my shelves at the beginning of that period in order to pay for the rest of the sales for the month, right? So you just take the dollars on the shelf on day one, and you look at how much sales are over the course of that month. And when you do that, you discover that 68% of dispensaries have over a month of inventory and supply right now. In fact, the average dispensary is carrying 1.7 times its total monthly sales and inventory, or 51 days of inventory. And this is data from looking at how much in inventory stores had on January 1st and seeing how much sales were for the month of January on the average store across a sample of about 240 stores in a good 5 states. And what this equates to is about $132,000 per store in oversupplied inventory. So again, if you just take a look at the dollar retail value of inventory on day one, you look at how much was sold over the course of that month, and then you look at how much is at the end, and basically what you realize is there's about 132 grand difference per store that is ultimately debt that they can't pay back to the distributor. However, this is a simplistic view of the world. You have to understand how this actually happens at the SKU level. So when you actually look at the SKU level, the individual product level, you can think of it in a case in which, I have $500 in retail value of Wild on day one. Over the course of the month, I take on another $500 of inventory and retail value from Kana and Kiva. I then sell out of those SKUs, which means at the end of the month, I still have $500 of retail value for Wild. And over the course of the month, I sold $500 of retail. So if you take a simplistic point of view and you say, hey, I had $500 on day one, I sold $500 over the course of the month. At the end of the month, I still have $500. I'm good to go. But I would ask anybody to say, do they believe, based on the fact that that wild sour apple didn't sell at all over the course of the month, that they actually have enough inventory for the next month? And I think the answer would be no, right? Something is wrong with that SKU. It's not selling. So for me to make my sales for the next month, I need to acquire an additional amount of inventory to meet my sales goals, inventory that actually physically moves. So what's happening is I'm essentially carrying Wild as a debt month to month to month because it's not selling. And when you look at this across all the SKUs, right, across all the stores, what you realize is there's a lot of SKUs that aren't really moving at stores. So when we look at a 2-week period of just the end of January, what we find is that the average store, first off, has about 500 SKUs. And the average SKU over that course of that 2-week period made $200 and sold about 2 units per week, which is not that much volume. On top of that, as stores get bigger, they generally just keep adding more SKUs. So this is true for small stores and true for large stores, because what we're finding is that as stores are selling more and more and more, they're adding more and more and more SKUs. But these things aren't necessarily causally related, right? It's a correlation problem. And when you aggregate it at the SKU level and you actually look at, therefore, how much in overall debt that stores are carrying at the SKU level, what you realize is that 32% of inventory that people had on January 1st, we actually look at SKU by SKU by SKU, did not sell in January. In fact, 20%, so 1 out of every 5 SKUs, has no sales in a 2-week period. 0. That makes up 13% of this debt. Essentially meaning that it's not even a matter of the fact that the SKUs are moving slowly. It means 1 out of every 5 SKUs isn't moving at all. It is nil, 0, dead. And what this amounts to is that the average store is about $165,000 of retail value and surplus per store at the SKU level. And what you're dealing with then is all of a sudden this dichotomy. So I have all these SKUs that aren't moving at the beginning of the month. which means that for me to make my sales number for the month, I need to acquire SKUs that actually do move. And when we look at this over a 14-day time period, over the last 2-week time period, what we see is that about a quarter of all the dollars a store makes over the course of 2 weeks, 25%, comes from SKUs that they acquired over those 2 weeks, fast movers. So you're dealing with a situation, right, in which at the beginning of a 2-week period, consignment period, you have about $500,000 of inventory per store in retail value. Over the course of that 2 weeks of what you currently have in stock, you sell about $160,000 per store on average. You then acquire another $50,000 that then immediately sells out, right? Making it so that on total, you're selling $235,000 over the course of 2 weeks. But what this means is that you actually didn't have at any given 2-week period, the beginning of a 2-week period, you don't have enough inventory to make up your sales numbers for that 2 weeks. You actually need 3 more days of inventory. So how can you rationalize the fact that the average store has 50 days of inventory, but then at the beginning of a 2-week period, right, you need to acquire 3 days of inventory? And it all comes down to these slow movers, because in the process of bringing in inventory to make up your sales numbers for those 2 weeks, you're ultimately also bringing in some duds. You're bringing in some not movers, like slow movers, that then help stack that overall debt. SKUs that just aren't going to move overall. And in fact, if we look at the last 14 days of January, what we see is that the average store in the market grew their actual overall inventory level by 3% over that time period, on top of having an inventory level already, which we quoted, right, which is nearly 1.5 months of overall inventory. In fact, 56%, over half of all stores, grow their inventory over a 2-week time period. Now, you could say, well, that's fine because at the end of the month, they'll just run a liquidation and they'll bring it all down. But when we zoom out and we actually look at like last 45 days, taking December all the way through the holidays through halfway through January, what we find is that this is just not true. Most stores the average store is carrying about $500,000 of retail value month to month to month to month, right? When we look at December 1st, the average store had 644 grand in inventory. Over the course of 45 days, they acquired another $1 million, $600,000 of inventory in order to sell on average about $1 million over the course of that 45 days per store. But they still, at the end of that, had about $500,000 in retail value sitting on their shelves, right? We see this consistently looking through the last year. Everyone, or the average store, is floating about $500,000 of this debt every single month. In fact, if you look at this at the size of the entire California market, what you realize is that for the California market over a 45-day period from December 1st through January 14th, sold about $530 million of retail value of sales. In order for them to hit that number, they had to acquire $795 million of overall inventory. If you aggregate this up to the entire cannabis market, what you realize is that there's about $3 billion of excess retail value of inventory that was carried into the new year over the last 45 days. So how can we solve this, right? What are some simple solutions we can talk about to take a look at this? So at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to just say no. Don't reorder what's not selling. This may seem like a very simple thing to do, but the reality is with 500 SKUs on the average menu, it's work. It is a ton of work to do the math on every single individual SKU to determine what is not selling. In fact, we at Happy Cabbage have developed a proprietary statistical algorithm to be able to detect what these essentially non-sellers are. And what we find is that the average store is carrying 10% of their inventory is this like non-selling, slowing down, decelerating demand inventory that ultimately is going to end up in the pile of debt that's going to get carried over month to month. In general, more expensive things in the market, like vapes, have a higher problem of this than relatively cheaper things overall. The other simple solution people really need to do is stock to actual demand. Don't overstock what's brand new. So what does that mean? It means taking a look at your actual internal data of your actual run rates at a SKU by SKU level. And when you're restocking going into the next 14-day, next 30-day period, is only stocking to the actual demand level of your store. What does this mean? It means as you're considering bringing in new items, don't simply assume that that new item is going to sell and fly off the shelves because some market data report says it's going to fly off the shelves. Take it in at the smallest possible batch you can, observe the fact that it's actually moving, and then generate a restock. When you look again at that SKU level debt, a ton of that is made up of these newer products that came in that didn't have any historical data of performing at that store that just don't perform. And at the end of the day, that just continues to stack up. The other thing on top of this, by saying stock to demand, is don't stock to when something runs out. So don't say, hey, when I have something in my back room and that's gone to zero, I must therefore restock a case pack of that. Because ultimately what you're doing is you're just restocking up that debt level that you're carrying month to month. Instead, when that case pack in the back room runs out, say, how long did it take that case pack to run out? And if it took over 14 days for that case pack to run out, don't restock it, right? Because ultimately what you're just asking is to take on something, take on debt that you're not going to be able to pay back over a 14-day window. And here's the thing, this simple approach actively works. Through tools that we at Happy Cabbage have developed that incorporate these practices and letting stores utilize them, we actually had a very elegant sort of experiment that got developed across a 3-store chain in California. Essentially, we had 2 stores that were using technology and using these practices of not restocking what is not selling and stocking to demand. And then 1 store, which was still in the practice of basically restocking based on when things ran out in the back room. What you can see is that the 2 stores that were using the practices that I just laid out were able to reduce their overall debt, right, by about 200 grand per store in overall retail value. In fact, one of those stores eliminated all inventory that was going to last for over 6 months and massively reduced it down to essentially inventory being able to last less than 30 days. That 3rd store, the one that didn't do this practice, over the same time period, increased the overall retail value of the amount that they were holding by nearly $370,000, right? Ultimately adding things back into that debt pile. So, thank you. If you want to learn more about this, happycabbage.io, sign up, take a demo, take a look at some of the tech that we have that's addressing this issue, because we as an industry need to solve this. When you see big stories like Herbal going under, not being able to pay back its brands, and telling you that millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that were owed were sitting on the back rooms of all the stores out there.